Welcome back to the Pilgrim Faith Podcast, where human wonder fuels the quest for Christian wisdom. Today, my faithful and good co-host, Dale Stenberg, and I are happy to be joined by Dr. Joshua Rasmussen to talk about his recent book, How Reason Can Lead to God. We both read this book and enjoyed it very much. And maybe Dr. Rasmussen, or I'll call you Josh now.
Sure.
Maybe one way of beginning our conversation is to talk about the book actually as a piece of rhetoric. Within the last year, one sort of what's analog to your book might be something like Lewis's Miracles, where he develops his famous sort of argument from reason. And I read that in the last year or two, and I was fascinated by it, actually, partially for its argument, but also by its rhetoric. I was fascinated by the rhetorical approach he took. And as I was reading your book, I was sort of reminded of this, that I'm on the one hand fascinated by this very fine-grained argument you're making, but I'm also fascinated by the book's rhetorical nature, the way you're appealing to the reader. Two of the things that kind of bookend that for me were you begin with this fascinating statement that key to minimizing error is intellectual humility. I thought that was a fascinating thing to emphasize on the front side, but on the back side, and I saw this sprinkled throughout the book actually, but you end on a note of saying this book is written for anybody with a kingly nature. And I thought that was a fascinating appeal.
Or queenly,
exactly.
Gender discrimination.
A regal nature. I make in my own writing, I've found, for whatever reason, in our own sociological time, for whatever reason, that same motif has struck me as a very important one to appeal to. And I wonder if you could, speak for a minute about, on the one hand, this pole of humility, and yet on the other hand, this pole of there's something of the regal in the philosophical quest, and why those are important emphases to you.
I appreciate that you were seeing that. I mean, that was something that I really worked on, because I wanted this book to serve people. Ultimately, I wanted to serve people. And in the book, I actually talk about a dream that I had where I was having a philosophical conversation with somebody, and it was on the problem of evil. And that in my dream, the person turns their head, and I saw that it was like shaved off in the back. And I was like horrified. And the person in the dream was telling me that he was in a war. And I still remember the feeling of the dream. It was like all of a sudden I realized that we were having a philosophical conversation, and he put out a stump of an arm and said, "I want to feel your compassion." And then I woke up, well, right before I woke up, I had the desperate desire for him to feel my compassion. But prior to that, I wanted him to know that I was right, so, because I was making my argument and I thought he was wrong. And I mean, philosophy is a complicated thing, because you want people to see what you think is true, but everybody sees different things. And one thing I want to be very careful about is I don't want to just advertise a package of beliefs to sort of sell it so that I can get them to agree with me. What I really want to do is have ideas that can serve people, and they can turn it over in their own minds and see, okay, does this serve me? And that was kind of the whole theme of the book, was to make a case that reality is fundamentally awesome, more awesome than you realize, and that the reasons to think that actually point to your awesomeness. So I want to treat the reader as a treasure, because otherwise it defeats the whole point of the book. And I want to add something else too, because I was also thinking about how to present it, how to organize the ideas, because they're very complex ideas, and I wanted to create a way that readers could relate to the ideas. And I was actually praying about it, and I felt like God gave me this, I don't know, it was just that feeling in prayer, like God was telling me to use pictures, use images. And so that kind of motivated me to think about having the picture of a bridge. So you're taking step by step across the way. And anytime I would go through my reviewing the draft and try to improve the language, I would always think, okay, how can I convert this without loss of content to an image that readers can kind of pick up on? So that's something that I really had to work on.
You do that beautifully. Your mention of cartoons in the mind body problem, I thought was just an incredible image.
Well, thank you. I mean, and it was not easy at all. So I think I created a high bar for myself, because now I've been working on this new book on consciousness, the nature of persons. And I actually picked up How Reason Can Lead to God. I started reading that. I was like, okay, this is my bar. I want it to be, this sort of easy to read. And I actually found it very difficult to even get started writing my draft on this new book, because I had to remind myself, just go layer by layer. Do a messy draft and then try to improve it, try to make it cleaner and cleaner. And so it's not easy for me. I really admire people who have sort of that natural ability to communicate complex ideas in picturesque ways, because I feel like for me, and I'm not just saying this, like I feel like I really have to work at that, but it feels like it's worth spending the time doing that, so that the reader can enjoy the journey.
Yeah, you mentioned there how you wanted to present something easy to read. I appreciate that, especially when you're talking about such complex issues.
Yeah.
For example, I was about halfway through the book, I think. I have a 14-year-old son, and I grabbed him and I said, when Daddy's done with this book, you're going to read this. Because I think that you can basically follow what he's saying, even if there's a lot of things to fill in, because you're going to have
4-year-old?
14.
Oh, 14. Oh,
yeah. Yeah,
Dale starts in young.
Yeah. My genes
I think
aren't
you're right.
that
Yeah,
good.
I heard a 12-year-old review the book and seem like they grasp it.
Yes. And if somebody can distill down such complex fundamental concepts into language, rhetoric, that a teenager could pick up and sort of get the gist of, that's a science and an art. You have to have the artistic mind working with the scientific mind in order to produce something like that. And I assume it'll just get easier as you do it more. So you're young still, and just keep it up. But to get into like the contents of the book. So it's How Reason Can Lead to God. And then the subtitle is A Philosopher's Bridge to Faith. You already mentioned the bridge. So maybe it would be helpful to give us the planks that you lay that form the bridge. And you're always appealing to the foundation that holds the bridge up.
Yeah.
And that's really what the book is about. Understanding the foundation and the steps along the way to the bridge to lead you over here to the treasure. So if you can give us a 10,000-foot view of your moves and the planks that you want to tell us about, the tools that you're using.
Yeah.
And then maybe the steps along the way of the bridge and how they relate to the foundation all the way to the treasure.
Okay. I'll describe a few things and you guys can draw me out a bit.
Okay.
I wanted just to add here that when I wrote the book, I kind of had like two different people in mind. One was just the professional philosopher, and then the other was somebody completely new to it. And so when I was doing my revisions, I would do the revisions with somebody completely new in mind. And then I would do another set of revisions with the professional philosopher in mind. And, then I would kind of read it sort of with both, see, okay, could both kind of figure it out. And the reason why I did that was because I wanted it to go deep. Like I didn't want it just to be, just a shallow summary of some of the themes in philosophy of religion. I really wanted to articulate some of the things at the edges of my own thinking, really. And so in that Foundation of Reason chapter, for example, I share some updates to my own thinking about the nature of propositions and thoughts and reason itself. So I do take it to the edge of my own thinking. And for that reason, even the pieces in there, I have these sort of advanced boxes where you can go deeper.
Yeah.
And some of those things I'm continuing to turn over in my own mind. But the basic structure of the bridge is basically I start with the first step onto the bridge, which is to realize that something is real, something. Like you are real, something exists. And I want to start there because I want to start with something that I think can be very clear. My goal is to invite readers to see things for themselves. So at no point am I going to just like appeal to an authority, unless you can also check it for yourself. So like I could cite the scholars, according to the philosophical consensus, there is something, right? Like according to mainstream science, things are real, right? Like there's biological systems, therefore something's real, right? But But I believe that you have the most power if you can check things for yourself. So that's the first step onto the bridge. And then the bird's eye sort of description of the bridge is that I go from the observation that something exists to an ultimate explanation of how anything can exist. So I argue for what I call the foundation theory. So if this represents reality, reality includes some kind of foundation to explain how there can be anything rather than just nothing. So I make a case for that in kind of the first set of steps I lead to this foundation. And then in the second set of steps, I probe the foundation and I investigate what kind of foundation could be a foundation for everything that we see. And so I make observations about what we see. Well, we see material structures. We see within our own experiences, consciousness, thoughts, feelings, emotions. We see our sense of right and wrong. It's not just that we have senses. We have very specific kinds of senses, a sense of good, a sense that things haven't gone right. We see that there are principles of reason. For example, it seems like if something is completely red, it can't also at the same time be completely not red at all. Well, how do you know that, right? Well, because there's this basic principle of reason. It can't be both A and not A. There can't be square circles anywhere in the universe. So that's another observation. And so what I do is I look at, okay, well, what kind of nature could ultimate fundamental reality have in order for reality to include geometric forms that lead to complex creatures, consciousness, a sense of right and wrong, principles of reason, a sense of value, the value of being a person, all these things. And I make the case that this ultimate reality wouldn't just be fundamental and uncaused and ultimate, but it would also have a certain kind of supreme nature, which allows it to give rise to all the different effects. Right. And so that's the basic structure of the bridge. And then we get to this sort of obstacle to the end, which is the problem of evil. And so we work through that.
That's one of the things that's, I think, another appeal in the book that is fascinating is, in a way, almost one could say the book is an attempt to get you to be re-enchanted with the very nature of reason. That it seems like part of what you're trying to do. I think there's a couple of sections where you're saying, like, it seems audacious to say that this small tool really can reach as far as it does, but it just does reach as far as it does, and that should actually fill you with wonder. And sometimes I think in contemporary philosophy of religion, there's a sort of, you sort of riff on the rationalism and the problem of the Enlightenment, and that led to the Nazis, and you can't, a reason, you're not sure where to put it anymore. And I actually thought it was fascinating. There's a way in which you kind of combined the disenchantment discourse almost with appeal to reason. And I thought that was for me a very, very effective appeal. And to add to that, to effective appeals, I actually thought some of the most fascinating content in the book was your attempt at the end to work through obstacles. My own, I did a PhD in the humanities, and my own dissertation was on the why modern atheism is plausible to people. I'm kind of riffing on Charles Taylor, and particularly I confront the problem of divine absence, but more as a phenomenological than a philosophical apparatus, if you will. But your particular discussion of divine absence, which starts with sort of a philosophical discussion, goes in a theological direction that I thought was just very beautiful. In fact, I found your account of theodicy, there are, you only spend 4 or 5 pages, but I thought it was about as compelling a 4 or 5 pages as I've read on theodicy. And so I thought those moments were, so maybe that's one way to start, is maybe to talk about the theodicy and the divine absence actually elements, because those are such compelling things to people. And in the theodicy section, I think one of the things you try to camp out on is what makes a good story. Maybe you could say what you're developing with the notion how story relates to theodicy.
So what I see as being at stake here is a certain kind of obstacle. Now I position this at the end of the bridge, but you could also think of this as sort of at the beginning of the bridge. Like, why would I take this bridge that's purporting to take me to this great treasure? That fundamental reality is so awesome that it actually would love me and have powers and all this stuff that's so great, this great treasure. Why would I even get started, right? If I'm making observations that would seem to discount that.
Mm-hmm.
And the basic worry is that, well, actually, just before I get into this, I love what you just said a moment ago about helping people sort of appreciate reason as a tool to find out reality, because that's also one of the barriers that would keep people onto a bridge like this. Is there's a kind of association with reason, sort of with that enlightenment, that rationalist project of trying to get certainty and figure out all this stuff just through reason without the tools of observation and scientific methodology. And so that's why actually in that section, I talk about how reason is actually part of science. They go hand in hand. And I also talk about the value of humility, because I think that that worry about being prideful and overly triumphal and arrogant or conclusive in your proofs also keeps people from embarking on this sort of curious journey. But on the problem of evil, the basic problem is that, right, like we observe things that are negative, that seem to be departures from greatness. But if fundamental reality is supreme, it's purely positive, I call it, or perfect, then why in the world would anything ever depart from perfection, right? I mean, you might think if it is perfect, everything that it would produce would always be constantly perfect. It would have the desire to do that, the means to do it, right? So if you see anything negative, that would kind of just confirm that view of reality. So why even start this bridge, right? And you mentioned the feeling of the absence of God. There's that existential feeling. And then there's also the philosophical puzzle about, like, if God's real, why would he not want me to know that he's real? Right. And I feel like these are just very, very important, deep questions. And I don't claim to have easy answers. In fact, at the beginning of that section there, I talk about how there's lots and lots of material on this topic. So all I'm going to do is try to separate the clear from the unclear. That's sort of my basic strategy. And I find it's helpful for me to just kind of like own that, okay, here's what seems clear to me. And then I invite you as a reader to just consider for yourself what seems clear to you. That way I can just sort of be honest about how things look to me. And so, so I give this, what I call it, the story theodicy, which organizes a lot of different features of the world in terms of the value that stories can have in the experience of conscious beings. So, I mean, there's a reason that we actually like movies where there's tension, there's drama, there's resolution, there's discovery. There's some kind of conscious experience there that is valuable. There's this experience of love in new ways and from new angles. There's an experience of a building of relationships, an experience even of certain kinds of relationships where you have beings who know more relating with beings who know less. And that creates certain kind of interesting dynamics, even romance. And so I sort of conceive of the whole of reality as being a kind of great story with plots inside plots, stories inside plot, stories inside stories. And that I actually would argue, I've been thinking about this again, just even recently, that I would expect, if fundamental reality is perfect, is supreme in its nature, that it would be interested in great and interesting kinds of relationships with a variety of beings, organized into consciousness raising or expanding stories, adventures. And I don't say that this is, the entire explanation for all evil or anything like this, but that it can help us to separate the clear from the unclear. So here's what's not clear to me. It's not clear to me that if there's something negative, that it isn't part of some greater good, or that it won't be worked out in a way that makes it so that anybody who experienced that would say, you know what, this was actually worth it in the larger picture. So that's not clear, right? I mean, to me, that's just, it's not clear that God with an infinite mind wouldn't be able to work out value and wouldn't have good reasons for allowing departures from the good to turn into greater good. Whereas if the previous steps of the bridge go through, then from my own perspective, it seems clear that something exists and it has a foundation, and that foundation would have to have the kind of nature that's consistent with everything else that we see. And so that's kind of the strategy there, is to separate the clear from the unclear.
It reminds me of, have you read Tolkien's The Silmarillion?
I have not.
Okay. It's a labor. You have to be committed. But
He's an
but,
analytic philosopher. He'll make it.
yeah, well, that's true. But it's the mythology about how the whole universe of Lord of the Rings came into being.
Mm-hmm.
And God creates these angels, a host of angels, and he gives them all a certain chorus to sing, a certain part in a chorus to sing. And every part of the chorus, the angelic chorus, is in harmony. And then one part of the chorus gets out of harmony, right? So it steps outside of the whole fluid motion of this perfectly synchronized angelic harmony. And that's the devil. But what God does is he takes that aberration in the melody and he weaves it back into, synthesized to the whole thing. So I think when we talk about evil in the way that you talk about in your chapter on morals, is that there seems to be something that steps outside of that which is natural to the perfection of the foundation.
Yes.
That is nevertheless getting woven back into the foundation precisely because the foundation is perfect.
Yeah.
That leads me to something I want to ask you, just because I think people will be interested to hear this. So when you talk about the foundation that supports the bridge, first of all, let me set it up like this. You use the term blob of existence.
Yeah. This is the blob right here.
Yes. I told my wife, I said, whenever I read a philosopher use a term like blob of existence, I know we'll probably get along on a real personal level. So, all right. So we've got the blob of existence, which just means everything that does exist exists within the blob. That is all of existence. It doesn't matter. And I appreciated this too. It doesn't matter if you think we live in a hologram.
Yeah.
That makes no difference. It's still inside of the thing that is existence.
Yeah.
And then you talk about how we cannot you talk about dependence and independence. I cannot make a white tiled floor from purple tiles. If I only have purple tiles, all I'm going to get is a white tile floor. But the foundation has a nature that's not dependent.
Right.
So talk to us a little bit about how a non-dependent, maybe you can just say what you think the foundation is in its nature. And then how can a non-dependent nature then, given your reasoning, lead to things within the blob that are dependent?
Yeah.
That are not necessary. How can like a necessary being lead to non-necessary beings? Yeah. So yeah.
No, that's good. Well, I was excited a moment ago when you were talking about the song, right? Like folds like a song. And in my dialogue book, I've got a dialogue with another philosopher, Felipe Leon, on Is God the Best Explanation? And I also develop, so I wrote that dialogue sort of just after I finished How Reason Can Lead to God. And I talked about this great story in that book, but I also talked about it in terms that could be interpreted as a song. So I loved how you put that, right? Because you could think of God as being like an artist on every dimension, right? That God sings and then there's this rippling out from the music, and there's angelic beings, and then things can go wrong, but everything that goes wrong is allowed or can be worked for a greater good. So I wanted just to note that there. And then going back to the blob of everything. Now, one thing that we have to get careful about is that, you know, I in the book, I say, well, could God have created the blob of everything? Is that possible? And the problem is that, well, the blob of everything includes everything, even God. So in order for God to create the blob of everything, God would have to like create himself. And this would, I think, be problematic, because I've defined the blob of everything as just the total of all that is real. So then you pointed out this principle that, well, from dependent things, we're not going to get an independent totality, because just as like these yellow things added up will only add up to more yellow things, how can you take purely dependent things that depend on other things, even if there's infinitely many, even if there's an infinite stack of dependent things, it seems like the whole stack is dependent. But if reality in total has nothing to depend on, then that does lead to a puzzle. So my solution is that there's a foundation, and the foundation is not outside of the blob of everything. It's actually the fundamental layer within the blob of everything. And so now in this metaphor, this is no longer the blob of everything. This is the blob of dependent things. And then this is the independent foundation, and the blob of dependent things depends on the independent foundation. So that helps solve the puzzle of how there can be anything. The way there can be anything is that there's some special thing that exists in a special way. It doesn't depend for its existence on other things. It provides the ultimate anchor of all other things. Then you
because
ask,
of its nature.
Because of its nature, yeah. And as Joe was pointing out, its nature would have a necessary nature. So by this I mean it cannot not be. That's the kind of thing it is. It's the kind of thing that cannot not be. Unlike these things, I would argue these things that are dependent, they can not be. They have the possibility of non-being. In fact, that's all the more reason to wonder, why are these things in being if they might have not been in being? So they're contingent. And so then, well, how does the foundation cause the contingent things, the dependent things? And here my argument is that, well, in order for there to be these dependent contingent things, there has to be a source of them. And so then the foundational thing is the source by a kind of basic action of willing or causing or bringing about. I leave it open, actually, whether it's a personal cause earlier in the book, and then later I argue that it would have mental resources to produce consciousness and things like that. So ultimately, I think there's a kind of basic causal connection between a necessary foundation and the contingent things. The causal link is, I would say, non-deterministic. And what I mean by that is that if the foundation is necessary and the effect is not necessary, then it can't be necessary that the foundation makes that effect. So there has to be some kind of contingency or non-determinacy between the cause and the effect, if that makes sense. It's sort of like a free choice in a way.
Yeah.
You know, it's not deterministic that you go this way or that way.
Right. And in a classical account, that would probably, you know, just as in Dale's analogy he brought up, could have even had like angelic mediation. You could imagine having some sort of freedom in the develop of, well, I mean, at least that's one.
Absolutely. Yes.
I wonder what you think about this, because, you know, a lot of our audience would be sort of readers of Thomas and such. And I mean, I think there's a lot, some of our audience would be familiar with kind of analytic categories. But one of the things in kind of the Thomist tradition, and I think in the continental tradition as well, and really I'm asking this not because I have the answer, I'm asking this whether this is a confusion in your judgment of, or a difference of mental content, or whether it's a difference just of philosophical grammar. But in one tradition, it seems like sometimes you'll hear the language of totality, right? That you don't want God. Somehow there's a reticence to making any move where God and anything finite can be contained in a set term. And I've in other words, like, can a set of anything contain creation and God? And I wonder, is that a sort of impossible to avoid way of putting it to you, or is that just a difference in philosophical grammar?
So it could be both, depending on how it's interpreted. So I hear what you're asking. So one way we could interpret this is that in addition to all the dependent things, and in addition to the independent foundation, there's this additional thing which we'll call the set of all the things. And the set exists. It exists as an additional item. But there's famous paradoxes with the idea that there could be a set of all the things, because if there's a set of all the things, and if the set is one of the things, then that means the set includes itself as one of the things.
Right.
And as soon as you have self-membered sets, then you get that famous paradox of the set of all the non-self-membered sets.
Yes.
And you can ask, is that set self-membered or not? And either way it goes to
Is
contradiction.
the barber who shaves everybody that doesn't shave himself
Yes,
shave himself?
exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
So there are paradoxes there. So what I would do to sort of stay clear from those things is I would make a distinction between there being a thing, broadly understood, an entity, a set, whatever, that includes all other things. Okay. On the one hand, I'm not going to say that, versus that we can just refer plurally. We can just refer by a plural term to just whatever there is. So if I say that whatever there is either God or dependent on God, I don't think I've said anything that I should be ashamed of, right? Like anything that's false or problematic. I mean, there are some technical distinctions even there in debates that philosophers will have about plural reference, but I would make the case that there's actually not a problem with just referring to everything. As long as we don't think of it as a set.
Yeah, I think even in the classical tradition, of course, you do have terms like being or the transcendental properties that I don't want to say straddle God in creation, but at some point there's handles that sort of transcend the created order. Even if they're sort of negated. God is love, but not in this way, or however.
Yes.
But there's some nevertheless some connection between. Well, and in fact, that's just what it means to be made in the image of God. I wonder
could add
if
one more thing on this. So the way that I've been thinking about, especially recently, is that if God is the ultimate foundation, the independent, then everything else, including even our concept of the totality, depends ultimately on that foundation.
Yeah.
So it's not that the totality exists sort of in its own right. It's that the totality itself depends on that foundation.
Yes, the capturing of it in a straddled concept, which is distinct from the being of the thing as such.
Exactly.
That's okay. Yeah, that's a helpful distinction. Go ahead, Dale.
Well, I was going to say, I'm to sort of, unless you have something that's relevant to that last thing. Were you going to follow that up, Joe?
No. Go ahead.
Okay. All right.
Nope.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Joe and I talk too much.
Trip over each other.
Yeah. So I want to talk about reason for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
So right now in our sort of circles, Joe and I's circles, I don't know if you're even aware of this debate. You might not be, so I won't burden your conscience, brother. But there's sort of a debate that's happening with recovering the Thomistic tradition, classical metaphysics when we talk about God, and then a sort of they're at war with the sort of modern apologetic methodology known as presuppositionalism. Are you familiar with that term? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Reason is actually being debated, and you have a whole chapter on accounting for reason, why we can use reason in our discourse when we talk about God, why it's a necessary tool to understanding God as he is from observation and deduction. C.S. Lewis, Joe already mentioned this book, Miracles. In Miracles, he sort of starts to gesture at an explanation of reason as being influenced by supernature. So in other words, the foundational mind, as you talk about in the book, that is whenever conscious beings exercise reason, they are drawing from the power of the foundation in order to do that act of reason in a unique and special way. And so in that way, you can almost think of reason as being influenced by supernature. So number one, I'm interested what you think about that.
Yeah.
And well, first, I think what I'm interested in is how can we be sure that reason is a reliable tool in the pursuit of the knowledge of God, given the effects of sin?
Yep.
And two, is it plausible to understand reason as sort of tapping into the divine essence or the divine nature or the perfect nature of the foundation of
Yeah.
all of the things?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question because you're pointing again to one of those sort of initial barriers to even enter the bridge. And the way that I've heard it, well, it's interesting because I've heard skepticism about reason from both atheists as well as from Christians. So from atheists, part of the worry is you might be spinning webs of reason without tethering them to concrete scientific observations. So there's that worry. And then from the Christian side, what I hear is what you're pointing to is that we have a fallen nature. And so human reasoning is liable to error. And so if you rely on human reasoning to try to figure out the nature of things, then you're liable to being led astray. And sometimes this is contrasted with like being led by God's Spirit or being led by God or God's word. So there's a kind of contrast between human reason and then God's voice. And so, well, Dale, you were pointing to the very thing that I want to say here, which is that in my view, the very faculty of reasoning, simpliciter, okay, is not actually a distinctively human faculty. Humans have that faculty, but I think of it as a faculty that belongs to all, well, first of all, belongs to God. Okay, God has that faculty, and belongs to angels, belongs to humans, and that there's a faculty here that we have in common. So it's you might call it a spiritual faculty. So that's the first thing. The kind of power it is isn't really tied to human nature. In my view, it's a special thing that we actually have in common with angelic beings and God, is this power to reason. And then second, my argument in the book, and I'm actually kind of rethinking how my understanding of some of these things exactly, but my argument in the book was that when we are actually seeing these principles of reason that are true, the truth of 2 + 2 = 4, or the truth of nothing can be both square and not square at the same time, anywhere in all of reality, those truths actually correspond to a kind of abstract reality that's ultimately anchored in God's nature. And I still think something along those lines, that ultimately to even see necessary truths is to see something that's anchored in God, so that anybody who's reasoning rightly is in an interesting way coming into contact with aspects that are grounded in God or in God. So that you can actually have a kind of connection with God, even if you don't realize that it's God. God is sort of part of participating in your variability to see anything, right? Because it's almost like we divide the voices of God. We say, oh, well, the only way God can talk to you is through God's Spirit. It's like, well, what if one of the ways God talks to you is through reasoning? Like that's one of the
this
methods.
is Henri de Lubac in his book The Discovery of God makes a very, very similar point, because there's a whole school of sort of transcendental Thomists, I think they call them, in the 20th century, and their sort of whole argument is that the mind of man, they're kind of interpreting this statement of Thomas that God is implicitly known in all knowledge and implicitly desired in all desires. And they're looking at man. The famous quote they have is abyss calls to abyss. There's an infinite negative abyss in man in terms of his mind and will to desire and to know, that is fitted for a positive abyss in God. That is the ultimate object of knowledge and desire. And sort of what they see is every bit of knowledge, in a sense, man by very nature, in every bit of desiring the good and in every bit of knowing the true, is sort of approximating. But what we can see in ourselves is this dynamic where we latch onto a truth, just like you finished this book, you're satisfied, but then it just becomes the stepping stone to more thoughts. And then when you get those thoughts, it's a stepping stone to more thoughts. Is there a kind of end almost? Is there an ultimate hot take, as it were? The hot take to end all hot takes. And in a sense, what they say is that both in terms of desire and in knowledge, God is kind of that united end for the whole person. And so it's and I think it's very powerful. I think it's a very powerful argument.
And I think Josh makes that point in the book.
Yes.
Which sounded very Aristotelian, because, the first sentence in the Ethics is every thought, inquiry, I can never get the third thing, every thought, inquiry, and something else is aimed at some good. And Josh actually picks up on that in the book. And I was reminded of that because he's saying that your desire for these things is pointing to the foundation in some way, which was
yeah. And this might be a way of kind of building a bridge with the presuppositionalists that you mentioned, right? Because one of the values that presuppositionalists would have would be that God is playing a role in the formation of our basic items of knowledge, right?
Yes.
And so, if we contrast that with like human reasoning, you're relying on your own human reasoning. But if instead, actually, no, you are actually relying on this kind of divine reasoning or this divine power, you actually can't even use it apart from God being connected in that process.
Yes.
Then there's actually maybe a way of giving the presuppositionalists, what they want.
Right.
It's kind of a translation.
Yeah, that's a great point. Keeping in that direction, one of the things I'd love for you to talk about, maybe for a brief minute, and maybe this relates to your own story. I wonder if we're allowed to ask this. I wonder, was in your own conversion experience, did the philosophical journey play a role on this front? And one of the things I'd love to hear you talk about, because right now, in my own graduate school experience and in a lot of my friends' experience who are atheists, the role that neuroscience plays is just very large in the kind of just the imagination of how reality works. Once I'm staring at a brain and I can do this and they have feelings, well, now we've reduced the mind to the brain. And you get the kind of visceral reading, and maybe philosophical distinctions seem like too fancy. What's really going on here. And I wonder if you could talk about how do you, when you kind of feel in your gut that protest, was that part of your own kind of philosophical or your own religious journey to kind of think through those things? And how, when you hear somebody that brings that kind of neuroscience angle, what's your sort of immediate go-to to kind of help them work through that?
That's interesting. Well, let me just start with the neuroscience. So I've been immersing myself lately in the science of consciousness, working on this book. And it's so fascinating to me because there's so many studies in neuroscience about the power of consciousness to affect parts of our brain. Like you can there's a neuroplasticity of the brain through directing your attention in certain ways, through mindfulness. And then there's also interesting studies about your ability to affect remote systems through consciousness, through directing your thoughts. And there's interesting theories about how this works in terms of generating information in the quantum field. And there's even studies, I was reading something yesterday about how there are certain conditions where you actually diminish the brain activity and the richness of the conscious life increases, doesn't go down, but increases, which you wouldn't really expect that if you're just analyzing all of consciousness in terms of brain activity. I actually think there's a kind of a paradigm problem, so that we're sort of accustomed to thinking of sort of mindless bits of matter generating more complex bits of matter. And then eventually, once you get to certain complexity, consciousness comes out in some mysterious way. But I'm convinced that is actually just a completely upside down worldview. And the ramifications of flipping it around are kind of sprinkling into lots of different fields in science and also in parts of philosophy that I've been reading and contributing to myself, where actually it's the consciousness that's primary and everything else is built out of fundamental mental elements, including even geometric structures, such as brains and things like that. So that's just a beginning taste of that. As far as that kind of knee-jerk response, I think the problem, and I've been thinking about this a lot, is that there's a certain kind of authority that a narrative can carry. So if there's a narrative about what science says, and then I come along and say something different that goes against that narrative, that's already going to raise those red flags. It's already going to raise suspicion. And I've actually found it very difficult, because even if I start citing the latest science, then the worry is that, I'm cherry picking to create this other alternative idea that's like fringe and weird, because the mainstream narrative feels like it's just so mainstream, right? And I've been trying to make the argument that actually the mainstream science doesn't actually fit certain narratives about what's being projected on to science. The only way to figure that out is actually to look into the science, to study it for yourself, so actually I'm processing that, because I'm not sure, like, on a social level, what actually is always the best thing, what somebody really needs. For me, I could just say, now going back to my own times of doubt, back when I was in late high school, and kind of how I worked through that. For me, it wasn't so much that I latched on to a certain scientific narrative. It was more that I began to have questions that my inherited worldview just didn't seem to have the resources for answering.
Yeah.
And then when I began to study and read what scientists were saying, it seemed like, oh, these are truth seekers. These people are trying to find out the best description of reality, and they're not making reference to God. And so, I mean, maybe that is now, an appeal to certain kind of authority, right? And so then that made me really wonder, oh, okay, well then what are the good reasons? Are there any good reasons? And so that kind of led me into the place of searching and wanting to sort of see things. But the only thing that helped me was to take a look for myself, like actually read the scientific articles. And I just have to say that like the more that I've studied the different areas, the more that I find that there's so many different clues that all point to the transcendent nature of our existence. And when I say transcendent, I don't mean transcending reason, right?
Yeah.
But just transcending geometric shapes. Okay. Like that there's actually consciousness and it affects the world.
Yeah.
Are you hinting toward any, maybe this is a naughty word, so I suppose, but like, does this hint toward any kind of version of the idealist tradition in your judgment?
It does certainly point to that. I mean, let me just say, when I was in graduate school and I first heard of idealism, I thought it was strange, weird, unnecessary, and so I rejected it. But over the last 10 years, I would say 5 years, maybe even the last year, increasingly, I'd have to say everything's sort of shifted, so that what I even thought of as idealism wasn't even really what I would say idealism actually is.
Fascinating.
So everything's kind of flipped around, and now it's like the duck rabbit, like everything shifts, like, oh, I see something very different now. So I think it would be safe to say, I hesitate to use the word idealism just because of its associations, but probably there's no other term that that would best describe. I mean, basically mind, I would think is fundamental for describing everything else. And that's where I arrived at.
It's interesting because I think what your sort of project presupposes is a mind that's open, is a mind that's ready to go after truth. That's what I appreciate about the book. You're looking for truth seekers. There are people that have a priori written off a bunch of different theories about how we explain everything. And most people, if we're honest with ourselves, just really don't care. Most people don't care. Most people are just happy to get their Starbucks and go to the movies and look at Facebook and Twitter and argue and post pictures on Instagram. And we live, at least in the advanced modern West. So what I appreciate about the book is that you really are like extending an arm out to a rising class of people, young people that are really sort of like going, why am I here? We've got suicide that is skyrocketing, depression, anxiety, hopelessness. We've got it's a phenomena. It really is something that we all need to be paying attention to. And your book, I think, is a resource that I would feel comfortable handing out in terms of like a package of information to say, this can help you get somewhere in your quest for understanding why you're here, if those people exist. But I guess what I want to say is, for the skeptic who doesn't even think that these questions are relevant to what they believe on the ground. So for the engineer that's making $250K a year who drives a nice car, lives in a nice house, has a good wife, has a couple kids, life seems relatively peaceful. What's the need for them to understand this thing? Like
Yeah.
what how could we prompt those people to get a thirst and a hunger for understanding these big questions about why things just are here? How do we even pull them into the orbit of the conversation that you want people to be a part of? I guess that's really,
Yeah.
if I'm trying to take your book and bring it all the way down to the ground, which is I know what you're trying to do in the book, then how do we grab skeptics and how do we rope them in and go, think about these things because they're
Yeah.
important?
So you might have a better answer than me. I almost don't want to rope people in. Maybe that's not my skill set really, but I'll just be very honest. So I see so many people who are already very curious and they have this kind of existential angst. I get emails all the time from people who have these questions and people who feel like they have answers, but the answers are ultimately hopeless. And they're open to giving it another shot, having another look, expanding their thinking. But as far as somebody who maybe doesn't quite sort of feel that question, it might be that. So I've got a couple thoughts here at once. The first thought is I've been thinking about truths as being like a set of keys, so that these keys are like powers, so they can unlock doors, they can get you somewhere. But like not everybody needs every key at the same time. And sometimes, Jesus talked about like these things you're not ready for these things, or like some truths, it's like you're ready for these and maybe you're not ready for these others. That's kind of like one thought. And then another thought on the other side of that is I think everybody does have these questions. Like everybody does, like it shows up in different ways, but like everybody thinks about like, why am I here? Like who really am I? Like, what is this place? I mean, you don't have to be always thinking philosophically to just kind of wonder that. Why, like, does my work really matter in the end if I'm working so hard? And I think sometimes maybe if people feel like they don't have good answers to that or deeply satisfying answers, then they'll kind of try to fill those questions with other things, maybe distractions. People really want they want answers that can satisfy, but they want those answers to be actually true. So I think that's the thing, that people are really hungry for that.
Maybe a way of drawing us to a close is to ask, reason. Your book is called How Reason Can Lead Us to God. Maybe a final question is, can reason lead us to Christ? Is there another book to be written by you or somebody else that is taking that same sort of powerful tool and then looking at Scripture and the claims of Christ, and then moving sort of further on the journey toward God in Christ? Where are you at on that question?
Yeah, the way that I've kind of thought about it is, if you're familiar with Richard Swinburne's work on this connection, he talks about reasons that God would have to become incarnate, to identify with our sufferings and the human condition, to demonstrate love for us in a unique and special way, to enter human history. And he motivates then an argument for the sort of central message of God's redemption and God's love and forgiveness. This image of sins being put on a scapegoat. It's like everybody has this feeling of shame at times. And it's like, well, what do you do with that? I mean, at some point you need to know that God himself, the God of the universe, says, I forgive you. Look, I'm putting the sins on myself. Amen. Like, let me demonstrate to you like how much I love you and forgive you. So Swinburne makes the argument that through reason, you can actually anticipate that if fundamental reality has this supreme mind, this supreme nature, then it would be interested in this kind of story. In my classes, I have a class where it's a smaller class and we talk about these topics. And one of the things I'll do sometimes is I'll ask the students to describe their favorite movie. And then I'll ask them, okay, what are the attributes of a great movie? And I'll just put these attributes on the board. Okay, there was some kind of tension in the movie. There was some kind of hero. There was an experience of maybe something was discovered. There's romance, there's love, there's right. And then, okay, what's the greatest kind of love that you can think of? And you describe these things. It's like, oh, you actually discover that in the heart of human history, you have pointers to the fingerprint of God entering history and displaying love and forgiveness in the way that would kind of make sense of, this great story, right?
Yes.
And it's not that this is it, that's all that the story, there aren't other episodes that are related to it, but just that you can actually use reason to increase what they say is the prior probability, the probability prior to the historical evidence of this message. And I think that actually can make a big difference. It can even explain why somebody who looks at some evidence will say, well, I don't believe that is true. And somebody else looks at the same evidence and they think, oh, I think that this is true. And I don't think it's just like, well, one person's being stubborn or anything like that. I think that people have different prior probabilities that they're using to assess the evidence. So this is why, I could actually get very passionate about this, because I think the use of reason to help you to uncover prior probabilities is so important, like so valuable.
Absolutely.
And it's so overlooked. Like people don't realize the power of reason to help with that.
Yeah. I think that, are you familiar with Joseph Campbell?
Yeah.
So, this is, it was the synthesis of all of these stories of heroes and sort of charting out a pattern of how they all correlate with one another. All of these narratives from collected around the world, from all times of history, sort of communicate this one thing. And why do we see that pattern with us as humans, whatever we are? This particular species of animals, of humans, have invented this pattern of story to sort of give down to all of our progeny forever. That's a phenomenon that, sort of elicits your attention that you should investigate. So, brother, your book was great. I appreciate you. Keep it up. I have no closing thoughts, but I do want to sort of give you the last word. So you've already mentioned the next project that you're working on. If you want to reemphasize that and tell us about any of the other outlets that we can find you on or that we can investigate, whatever you're doing, please, this is the opportunity. Let us all know where we can get more of Joshua. And so I'm not going to say your last name. Rasmussen. Rasmussen, yes.
I always tell my students, just call me Josh, because the last name takes too much time to too many syllables. No, you guys, this has been just wonderful. I appreciate this time with you guys. Appreciate your work. And before the show, you were saying to me that you have a cool audience and that we're not all analytic philosophers. And yet, as we entered the conversation, you both very much impressed me with the fine-tuned insights that you have in the area of work that I'm passionate about. So I really appreciate that. And I'm sure it serves your audience very well. As far as my work, you can get free resources on my website, joshualrasmussen.com. There's just free articles there. Then I also have this worldview-design.com. It's a training center where this is a paid subscription, but it allows people to connect closer to Christian thinkers and idea leaders who are trying to build out their worldview. And I've been answering questions in there. I do a weekly answer to a question because I've been getting too many questions to answer all of them. So I'm just going to do one per week and post them in there. And then, so the work I'm working on now is this book on, it's called Who Are You Really? It's about the nature of persons, the nature and the origin of persons. So that should hopefully come out possibly this next summer. I told my publisher, I don't want to rush it. I gave him a draft and I said, but let's take some time to get some good reviewers and make sure that we develop this well. So that's where I'm at.
Great.
Very good. Anything else, Joe?
Nope. That's great.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you for tuning in. As always, you can head over to davenantinstitute.org and check out what we're doing there. You can go to the Davenant Institute YouTube page and find all of our previous episodes. as well as iTunes and any other podcast catcher that you have. We've got a Facebook page and a Facebook group. Pilgrim Faith Podcast is the Facebook group. You can join the conversation and interact with whatever we talk about. So, Joe, I love your brother.
Love you too, man.
And Josh, thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.